All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Reactionary Opinions. Round of applause for our returned wanderer, D-Dog. Welcome back, brother.
Oh,
Welcome back.
happy to be back. I have glad tidings. Everything's safe north of the wall, so we're all good.
Excellent.
No White Walkers in sight.
Fantastic. So, Russell, what's up, brother?
Yeah, no, look, everything's good. I've got just finished my last run this evening for Cape Town Marathon on Sunday, and I'm all good to go. I'm going to be running the Cape Town Marathon, so it'll be something to look forward to on Sunday. I'll send you guys my race number. You can follow me, my progress during the day.
Look
Kicking
forward.
ass.
Are you cooked? Look forward to. Check this out. Something to look forward to. Yes.
Hey, listen, I mean, the thing is, it's a challenge, you know. We're going to see what we can do.
Hell yeah, man.
Definitely.
I'm just happy I got my fat ass on the elliptical for 5 kilometers this morning. I consider that a victory.
Lovely. I also went for a run this afternoon, so we're all keeping our reactionary bodies fit and healthy.
Yeah, I felt fat shamed by Russell implicitly bragging about his marathons last time, and I'm like looking at myself. I'm like, ugh.
Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, we have a topic and a half for you this evening. We're going to be talking about the late, not so great, not great at all tyrant, Robert Mugabe. But more so specifically, we're going to be talking about Zimbabwe and Rhodesia and the history of Zimbabwe. But before we get into that, here's the meme of the week. It's actually, Dylan provided us with some dank-based memes. We got one year over here, the 30-year-old Rhodesian boomer.
I love that one.
It's Make Zimbabwe Rhodesia Again. It says, ditched my wife for a roadie girl. Yep, FNFAL, good rifle.
Right on.
Only sips glorious lion lager.
Lion lager.
It's pretty shit lager, shit beer.
Well, it's called Lion it was called Lion Lager up in Rhodesia and Zimbabwe, but it's completely different tasting to the Lion Lager in South Africa.
Really?
No, that's Russell.
Yeah.
Russell, that's what a roadie boomer would say.
No, that's what I say, because when I visited Zimbabwe in the late 90s, or in 2000, 99, 2000, around there somewhere, I tasted the Lion Lager, and it didn't taste like the Lion Lager in South Africa, and the Castle Lager didn't taste like the Castle Lager in South Africa.
Huh.
Even though it was owned by SAB, so I don't know what the hell was going on there.
Regional differences, I guess. Huh?
They're putting
Regional palates,
putting that water from Lake Kariba in there. Here's another good news. It's when you walk out of the gun show with a FAL and a one-way ticket to Zimbabwe, and it has like this boomer-looking dude with spectacles, sunglasses on, funky stash, safari suit kind of vibe, you know. Because I reckon that I've seen a lot of that on YouTube channels, about YouTube gun channels and stuff. These oaks, they talk about the FNFAL and all of that. It's a great rifle.
Yeah.
It's a really, really good rifle, make no mistake.
Yeah.
I mean, we've shot the FNFAL, Gideon Uber's weapon. Beautiful, beautiful weapon.
Yeah.
So anyway, moving on swiftly. Dylan, do you want to just sort of go through before we go through the show, you might notice on my screen, folks, that my video is crystal clear, and Dylan and Russell can no longer give me a hard time about my cuck internet. So
yes, it's clearer than the glacier waters of Eklutna Lake back home.
That's right.
It's tremendous.
It's absolutely marvelous. So D-Dog, you want to just sort of run us through the rundown of the show?
Yeah, sure. So basically, as fortune has it, we have an actual Rhodesian in our midst. I'll allow him to introduce himself. Maybe you've seen him before. But he's going to go into some detail. But basically tonight what we're going to talk about is the sort of the history of Rhodesia, sort of kind of why it was founded as a British colony in the first place, and then some of the steps that led to Rhodesia seeking independence from the British Crown during the sort of end of the British imperial era, and then kind of the Rhodesian Bush War a little bit, sort of the characters involved in there, and then basically kind of how Robert Mugabe and company ran the place into the ground and the fallout from that. So,
and if you guys don't believe me that we have a Rhodesian in our midst who will introduce himself shortly, check this out. Huh? Real Rhodesian. That's what I'm going to be flashing that picture, Russell. It's coming across the screen now. So, without further ado, should we talk about the first a brief history of Rhodesia? I don't know. Should we hand over to the Rhodesian?
Yeah, go for it. Tell us about that cat, Cecil Rhodes.
Tell us about that. It can be handed over to the only Rhodesian over here. Is one of those few people that are fortunate enough to have been born in a country that doesn't exist anymore.
No, I don't have a birthright whatsoever. This is the way it goes. But yeah, look, the history of Rhodesia is somewhat unbelievable, or people don't want to believe the story of Rhodesia, particularly people from the Western nations of Western Europe and North America. They don't really understand it. They don't really want to, I don't think, either. It's just a place where white supremacists oppressed black people, you know. That's the narrative. But interestingly, we'll take it from the beginning, and we'll work through exactly the points and what type of system Rhodesia was run on. But to get it started, a brief history. Obviously, Rhodesia comes from the name Rhodes, which is Cecil Rhodes, Mr. New World Order, the original globalist. Yeah, and he in 1890 founded the British South Africa Company. And what he did was he founded it down in Cape Town with the idea that it would explore and seek out mineral rights and assist in building the British Crown from Cape to Cairo. So there's actually pictures of Cecil Rhodes with one foot. You actually see him. It is like a picture of him over the continent of Africa, with one foot in Cape Town, the other in Cairo. And if you actually look at the map of Africa, the British influence ran right up from South Africa through the northern Rhodesia, through like Uganda, the Sudan, up into Egypt. So it actually did come to pass for a period anyway. But
so could have been if there was, I suppose, the Nile River and stuff, but it could have been the original soap peel.
Yeah, for sure.
The original soap peel.
I would
know what that means.
You know where the soap peel comes from, right? The saying.
The old salty weenie, yes.
Yeah, 1 foot.
But so the British South Africa Company then went into, crossed over the Limpopo into what is today Matabele land, and they actually went to Chief Lobangula of the Matabele, and actually purchased all sorts of purchased. You heard that correctly. They didn't just go in there and wipe them out. Purchased rights to explore for minerals, and they would pay him off monthly or annually or whatever it was for the right to do such. Essentially giving him mineral rights, paying him for the mineral rights. Right? They just wanted it, and they said, okay, well, we'll give you something for it. Up until then, obviously contextualize that. Up until then, that wasn't. That's not proper conquest. You know what I mean? That's actually incredibly civilized for the time.
The business deal.
Anyway, so straightforward business deal. So so what happened was the British South Africa Company, which was Rhodes's exploration company, actually started developing the country, started developing towns in and around agricultural and mining establishments. And what they did was they actually brought people in to develop the land, all that sort of thing. It was actually a fully corporatized country for the first, up until 1923, when Rhodesia actually became the British South Africa Company, handed over rule, not to Britain, that's a falsehood, not to Britain, handed over to a local governing authority with its powers to make its own laws, its own police force, and its own defense force. So the idea that Rhodesia was a colony of Rhodesia is actually false.
I mean, a colony of
Britain is actually false.
Okay.
The only thing that Britain provided for Rhodesia was services of foreign affairs. So basically, everything else they went via Britain for foreign affairs. Britain never had to bail out or give any sort of aid to Rhodesia ever. Rhodesia collected its own taxes, balanced its own fiscus.
So it was operated and made its own. So it was kind of like a Hong Kong situation, sort of. So they basically handled everything.
Very similar.
And then just because it was part of the empire, they deferred to the greater power to handle sort of foreign affairs, but they did everything else in-house.
Like a commonwealth.
Yeah, the day-to-day life. Yeah, but very, very self-governing sort of setup. And so obviously this situation continued until the early 1950s, where Britain actually assisted. They said, well, listen, after the World War, we want to actually you kind of piggyback off the resources of what was still then Southern Rhodesia. And they said, well, listen, why don't you join a federation? Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland. That would be Zambia and modern-day Malawi included into federation. What happened was federation existed, I think, from about 1951, 1952 till about 1963, around there somewhere. With what happened was soon after Harold Wilson's famous Winds of Change speech down in Cape Town, Zambia, basically what had happened was in the early 1961, I think, was it Ghana or Uganda? I think it was Ghana that was the first country in the Anglophone part of Africa to actually get independence. And shortly after that, so there was this whole thing, let's just get rid of, let's just dramatically pull out of Africa and just hand it over, you know what I mean? And now what had happened was you had a group of Rhodesians who had fought for Britain in the First World War, fought for Britain in the Second World War, fought for Britain in the Korean War, been involved in all the conflicts, supported them in everything, and now they were about to get the rug pulled out from underneath them. And obviously what had happened was the idea originally, the British had actually promised Rhodesia that they would, once if federation ended, they would be back to self-governing, and Zambia and Nyasaland would be handed over to a black majority rule, as you would say. So yeah, are there any questions so far, Dills?
Well, not much, man. So it sounds kind of, to me, it's sort of an interesting, this whole sort of part of African history to me kind of bears some semblance to westward expansion in some regard in the United States. So you have these little towns and communities. They're essentially company towns, you know, little mining towns or railroad towns. Exactly. And then so it's just sort of no man's land, kind of, you know, it's held by the empire or by the United States, but it's really unpeopled. And then they've sort of become these company towns. As you mentioned, the British South African Company. And then as they sort of expand, they get more peopled, and then they slowly become integrated into what we would recognize as a modern polity. So it's a really interesting history to me. And you see this sort of thing happen not only in Africa, for the U.S., but also in other places, like in the old Dutch East India Company and some of the things that happened on in the Caribbean. Very similar.
Yeah, very similar sort of setup. I'm a little bit of a fast forward. Obviously, the Rhodesians under Ian Smith's Rhodesian Front Party saw a issue with regard to that Harold Macmillan had actually gone on record as saying that it was either majority rule or nothing. You know what I mean? That Rhodesia was not going to be self-governing at all. They would not be able to determine their own future at all. That it had to get handed over, or that just wouldn't be recognized. And what had happened was eventually there were disputes, etc. And eventually Ian Smith actually, and the Rhodesian politicians at the time, tried to resolve the differences with Britain, but Britain was adamant, that it had to be majority rule, one man, one vote immediately. No roadmap, no nothing. No roadmap to gradual handing over, no nothing. It's all or nothing on the day, done, no more. And it was interesting. One of the interesting things which isn't known is that the traditional black views at the time actually supported the idea of Rhodesia obtaining independence, and not for themselves, but actually under the Smith regime. So the idea that the whole of every single black person in Rhodesia was on board with the revolutionary movement is actually false. I've got one of the things where I'm just reading an extract here about the viewpoint of which I found in a book that I've read by a writer some time back. But on traditional black views, it says at this point it would be appropriate to consider that the view of black Rhodesians in 1965, 75% or 3 million Africans of the total black population of 4 million resided permanently in the tribal trust lands, in which there was communal ownership of land. These territories were governed according to African law and customs through the kraalheads, headmen, and chiefs. They had their own ways of reaching decisions and how they would come about things, but eventually they would get to a big indaba, and that's how they would negotiate decisions entirely on consensus. I just want to find here. Yes, yeah. It was also be mentioned that the word vote doesn't exist in any African vocabulary, and the only way consensus can be achieved is as detailed in what I said. So they go through a whole process of discussion and consensus all the way through. It's not about just cast your name, your mic, your cross on a mark. That doesn't exist in African culture, particularly African culture at the time. So Smith organized a conference of paramount chiefs in order to obtain their views regarding the independence issues. 700 chiefs gathered at Dombashawa, 28 kilometers north of Salisbury, in October 1964. The unanimous view was that Rhodesia should be independent of Great Britain. Here's a quote from two of the chiefs who were present there. He says, he actually goes through and he says, now this is our custom. There's no such thing as one man, one vote, casting your vote on a piece of paper. This is quite foreign to our way of life. By our custom, our method of voting is to discuss the matter openly, as we are doing today in this hall. After a matter has been fully discussed, anyone who has any objections is invited to stand up and give his reasons for objecting. This is our traditional way of reaching unanimity. We ask government to respect our customs and our way of life. How can anyone expect us to cast aside all our tradition and live like animals without any culture? European customs are very unfamiliar to us. The European ways are very complicated when an African tries to adopt them. He says here, there's only one important matter which is in dispute. The leaders of the British Empire, whom we have always trusted, have now turned around and accepted the views of some of our children. These would be Joshua and Kobo and Ndabageni, and at that time, Zanu's Satoli, and wish to ignore the traditional leaders of this country. It is quite clear that the British government have accepted this because these people are now the marauding lions in our country of Rhodesia. So the idea that
so even the chiefs are like, these guys are bad news. Don't do what they say.
The idea. See, the thing is, what a lot of people don't understand about outsiders don't understand about African history is that it's not cut and dried. These revolutionary movements like the ZANU, PF, and ANC and that sort of thing, they presented themselves as being the sole representatives. They were able to destroy all political opposition so that they were the last people standing, the only people left. And then, no, we're the only ones that actually have a view, and the Western nations bought this whole charade.
Yeah. So I'm just going to interject here. There is this bears stark resemblance to a lot of revolutionary movements that have happened throughout history. Just as one example, the Soviet Union never, ever had popular support by the people during the revolutionary period, right up until they took power. Even amongst the proletariat, because most of Russia at the time was essentially peasantry, but even the proletariat at the time, it was very small. The amount of them that were actually part of registered Soviets and were voting wasn't even half. So the total portion of the country that was actually for the Bolsheviks during the time of the revolution, it was never a popular democratic thing to begin with. And it sounds like that's the same thing here in Rhodesia as well.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, the thing is, this is one of the big tragedies of the world. Right from the First World War, if you looked at the media propaganda around the Bolshevik Revolution, through all these revolutions, who were the greatest allies to the communists in the West? Media.
Yeah.
You look at it after the First World War with the Bolsheviks and the Bolshevik Revolution. You look at it in the Vietnam War. The media cost the Americans that situation. Look at Fidel Castro in the late 1950s. The New York Times wrote glowing reviews of Fidel Castro. So it's quite astounding how the narratives are built around complete falsehoods, and it's particularly in the 20th century. This plays itself out over and over and over again.
Yeah.
But I'd like to actually just shift. Obviously, with UDI, etc., what had happened was there were movements that were formed. Our man Robert Mugabe wasn't even a major player at this stage. He was a backbencher. All right, he was working himself up through in the gang. He was an outsider, actually.
Kind of a Lenin-Stalin situation. So Mugabe comes later. It's Lenin right now.
He was, very much, like you're reminding me. So, it's like we've seen this movie before, the playbook. But he was actually nowhere in the picture. The main players were Satoli and Nkomo at that stage. And those were the so-called revolutionary groups. Nkomo represented the minority tribal ethnic group, the Ndebele, which lived in Matabele land, and ZANU represented the 75% of the ethnic group Shona. And what had happened was those were the two power players. And in the late 1960s, Joshua Nkomo got a lot of his support from the Soviet Union, and ZANU got a lot of their support from Red China.
Imagine my shock.
Imagine my shock.
Yeah. And obviously, conflict had started. What was starting to happen now is that these Marxist groups, both of them, obviously inspired by revolutions in other parts of Africa and other parts of the world, like the Cuban Revolution, all these sorts of things, started basically using the same modus operandi, attacking vulnerable people in outlying areas, farmers, mission stations, mission schools, all sorts of intimidation, violence, like the chief said, they're marauding lions. These guys are out of control. And it's interesting to note that the Rhodesian Defense Force, one of the things that I put up there was that white soldiers were conscripted into the Rhodesian security forces, but black soldiers in the Rhodesian security forces were a permanent force and were not conscripted, and they would be allowed to be they're able to volunteer. And one must remember as well, by the early 1960s, Rhodesia's defense force, they didn't actually even have there were very, very few whites even in the defense force as a whole. The defense force was basically made up of, the permanent force especially, was only made up of the Rhodesian African Rifles, which was exactly what it says, black African soldiers with mostly white officers, and that was the only real permanent force at the start of the conflict. Obviously, more and more units were added, and for security purposes, there were for security and intelligence purposes, there were whites-only units, but that wasn't because of discrimination. That was just from necessity. They formed those units later, but at the start, there was the only full-time soldiers were actually almost all black.
The Rhodesian African Rifles, their theme song was Sweet Banana.
Yeah, there's a marching song. They used to, and the interesting thing about the Rhodesian African Rifles had fought in every war. So they had gone to the First World War, they had gone to the Second World War, they had gone to Burma. There was conflicts in Burma, Indonesia, all these Malaysia, all those areas that all fought for the British Empire. They were basically an empire's force. So that was the main, what made up, that's at the beginning anyway, most of the Rhodesian Security Force members. It's interesting to note though that at this stage, Mugabe working his way, he had actually gone to Fort Hare University and come back a Marxist. Fort Hare University, well, like so many other universities, really.
Yeah, you learn from the best.
That's
first class
university. I don't know what it is, man.
Yeah, it's the same. The same thing happened. Oh, I was just saying the same. I just keep bringing this up because it's just one of these. There's nothing new under the sun things. I mean, you see this happen again and again with these sorts of tin horn dictators. They get radicalized. They go to some Western university and then they get these bullshit Frankfurt School Marxist ideas turned in their heads, and they turn their countries into shitholes when they come back. It's just time and time again.
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole thing. But it's it's interesting. You got to hand it to we focusing on Mugabe at the time. Yeah, you got to hand it to him. He worked his way up through that organization. You must remember ZANU, or they had their army. Their army was called ZANLA, the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, but he was never in conflict. He didn't come up through the military ranks of the organization. He was a wheeler and dealer and conspirer and a backstabber and all sorts of things. All right,
a real slimy kind of character.
Slimy character. And there was basically at the time. There was, like I say, Satoli eventually got kicked out of, I think he got kicked out of ZANU, the guy who replaced him, his name was Josiah Tongagara, and he was actually the leader. He was tipped to be he was actually the leader of ZANU in Mozambique, because ZANU was operating in exile out in Mozambique. And it's I wouldn't say well documented, but a lot of people don't know. Robert Mugabe got to the position, got quite senior, and he conspired, obviously, with some other generals and senior military guys in Zanla. They actually assassinated Josiah Tongagara, and that's when Robert Mugabe took over. He came onto the scene actually quite late. He only really appeared onto the scene in the early 70s, relatively late, from about 73, 74, around there. Robert Mugabe appeared actually out of nowhere.
Russell, is that common knowledge that Mugabe actually had this guy assassinated, and not like a conspiracy theory or what?
Like I say, the ruthlessness of Mugabe, let's just put it at that, it's not unbelievable whatsoever. But I know that I read Ian Smith's book many, many years ago, and it was a lot of the intelligence reports that he would have received. They were quite convinced that Tongagara had been knocked off by Mugabe and his co-conspirators. So
it's sort of one of those deals like the Epstein situation. We don't have it on tape, but all other options, considered, it seems likely that that's what happened.
So let's just look at it right from the beginning. From the very early days, this man is ruthless. He's a sociopath.
Yeah, he rose to power. He rose to prominence much the same way that a drug cartel leader rises to prominence, by just being absolutely ruthless.
Yeah. No. Well, look, I mean, the thing is, this you're going to start seeing later on in the picture how ZANU-PF is not merely a political organization, but a gang. Quite simply put. And this is where it was birthed, way back in the early 70s. And so giving a bit of a picture of the ruthlessness of the man. He knows no bounds, sociopathic vibes, little empathy for anyone. But one of the things where I've actually got the note here, but it's just one of those. It's one of those things that we hold. Everybody knew, but it's not official. You don't find it in the history books, but everybody knows it. It's it's openly, commonly accepted. So what happened was Rhodesia was able to, even in spite of sanctions, in spite of financial sanctions and an economic blockade, actually have a higher economic growth rate in the early 1970s than the United Kingdom, in spite of economic sanctions.
Good God, seriously?
Yeah. In 1972, the Rhodesian dollar was stronger than the pound.
That's shocking.
Well, it's because the thing is, they were a small, efficient economy that was able to be well managed. They were always able to balance their balance of payments and their fiscus somehow. Even though fighting a war, they were somehow able to do it. I don't know how the hell they did it. I think they had very low. They had a very small state.
Yeah, they had Ron Paul working in their central bank, I guess, or something.
Yeah. So it basically, UDI, the guys that said, no, Rhodesia simply can't last. In 2 or 3 years, 4 years, they'll be on their knees. We'll have this matter resolved. And by 1972, 1973, when the figures started coming out, the British establishment went, now what are we going to do? Because this doesn't look like, this wasn't the script to be played. The Rhodesians seem to be
making it work.
Yeah, they're making this thing work. And what actually transpired then is what a lot of people don't actually understand. This is what essentially brought Rhodesia down. Another globalist, the Mr. Trilateral Commission, Mr. Council on Foreign Relations, probably the most wicked man of the 20th century. You know who he is, Mr. Dillon. You know who he is. Come on.
Are you talking about Mr. Henry Kissinger?
Yes, the man himself. All right, but he's still not dead. That guy. I want to see what obituaries come out for that guy when he dies. You know, he's the one that started all this
nonsense. Great diplomat, an American patriot.
Yeah, all this sort of thing. You know. Anyway, Henry Kissinger sees all of this. All right. Well, he somehow, I think the British asked for his assistance. You know, and what he does, he says, okay, listen, guys, I'll handle this. So what does he do? He flies out to South Africa, all right? And he comes to see B.J. Vorster, the Prime Minister of South Africa at the time, and they have a meeting. So basically, Kissinger makes a deal, because at the same time, Vorster had this idea that he could have a détente with the rest of Africa. You know, Africa's going through this whole revolutionary thing. Mozambique and Angola have just fallen, but he believes he can now reach out to the rest of Africa in détente, you know. So for some reason, I don't know, I don't know. I think that was some sort of falsehood. I don't think he really believed that. I thought that was just a cover story. But anyway, Kissinger has a meeting with him, and he says, okay, well, listen, things are getting actually quite hot for South Africa as well. I tell you what, we'll get off your case for 10, 15, maybe 20 years. But all you've got to do is suspend arms and oil supplies to Rhodesia, and don't buy their products. And we'll give you guys a break for the next whatever period.
So they won't sort of the media will kind of give them. Is that what you're saying, basically? Like,
no, the American diplomats and the diplomatic Britain and America's diplomatic corps will cut them a break.
Slack off a bit.
Yeah, if they put the hammer down on Rhodesia, and that's essentially what happened. The fuel supplies got stopped. Obviously a lot of trade. What would obviously happen, one of the sanctions busting things, how do you get your produce out? Or you simply sell it to South Africa and they sell it on, you know. That's sanction busting. You know, whatever you want to sell, you just sell out of South Africa, you know. You're going to sell it, just get the South Africans to buy your stuff and then it just gets sold on, you know, for a bit of a cut. But that was essentially how the start of it. When Ian Smith lost the support of South Africa, they were in a very precarious position. Although militarily the Rhodesian security forces were never under pressure of being overrun. In fact, they were actually making massive strides into on the military side. Militarily, a lot of people think they were losing, but they were actually winning. They were actually winning militarily in spite of all these sanctions and restrictions. You know, they struggled to get arms, etc. Some Air Force helicopter units that were stationed in South Africa on doing work were actually withdrawn from South Africa officially, just to show that they were committed to this sort of plan. So a lot of resources and sanctions busting was lost because of the Kissinger-Vorster agreement in about 1974, around the 74, 75, 76. I'm not sure of the exact dates. But what would then happen is, obviously, Ian Smith said, okay, well, listen, this is the short version. All right, he decided to reach an internal settlement with the non-ZANU and ZAPU members of the country. So it would your other non-revolutionary parties. He decided to make a deal with what was his name? I can't remember the guy's name. Abel Mirzarewa, that was the guy's name. He actually became, there was actually internal settlement, and they decided to have elections, had a decent voting turnout. And in 1979, Abel Mirzarewa became Prime Minister of Zimbabwe Rhodesia. They even changed the name to Zimbabwe Rhodesia. And it was all, all good and well, but that in itself, they changed the constitution. There was all sorts of reforms made, but that just wasn't good enough for the Western powers. It had to be handed over to Robert Mugabe or Joshua Nkomo. It couldn't be anybody else before they would get recognition. Regardless of what the situation was on the ground, the decision had been made that Robert Mugabe or Joshua Nkomo, but more likely Robert Mugabe, he had to be prime minister. That was the narrative, and the British and the Americans basically would not entertain any other options. So it's just quite fascinating how Western powers have continuously propped up Marxist elements in other parts of the world. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
How Western powers have always saved Marxism.
But why?
Isn't it? No idea. I mean, even in the Second World War, Stalin, who was at Roosevelt, sent massive amounts of arms and ammunition to Stalin to fight the Nazis. All right. He basically saved the U.S. and under Roosevelt actually saved the Soviet Union. Saved the Bolsheviks. Put it that way. You can see this all over the place, and it's not unfamiliar at all how it actually plays itself out.
Yeah, and early on in the Bolshevik Revolution, they got bankrolled by Western powers initially. That's sort of how they got their funding.
That's also
I mean, yeah, Western meddling in these matters is, it never turns out well in the long run.
One of the big farces of Robert Mugabe, always blaming Britain this, Britain that. He won't be an outpost of Britain. Britain put you in power. They elected you. Essentially, that is what happened. The 1980 election. Fast forwarding here now, we're going to 1980. The election in 1980 was a farce anyway, but Britain oversaw it, and because Britain had already decided that Robert Mugabe was going to be in power, they did nothing to say that the elections were. They said they declared the elections free and fair because they had already decided that. This sounds crazy. Nobody talks about this, but it's. I don't. The idea was that he was going to take over, and that was it. He was the designated man. And there's numerous testimonies of British election observers and all that sort of thing saying, no, these ballots were replaced, and there was all sorts of. The British basically ensured that ZANU-PF won that election.
Rings through to one of our earlier episodes. This is just a conspiracy theory.
No, well, look, like I say, I mean, the thing is, the reason why conspiracy theories are around is because there's always gaping holes in the official story. What do you expect people to do? I mean, are we supposed to just ignore what are critical? Are we not supposed to think critically? Well,
I think it's also the fact that people are starting to realize that it's not so unfounded for the powers that be to do these crazy things as well.
Yeah, not at all.
No,
this is the thing. Is
there's different competing theories of history, just in sort of like the grand meta sense. So there's like the Marxist dialectical materialist theory of history. Economic conditions drive history. There's the great man theory of history. Man rises up, changes things. You get your Napoleons and so on and so forth. But then the one that actually makes the most sense is the conspiracy theory of history, which is basically that different elites don't get along with other elites and they conspire and then they seize power. And if you look at it historically, that's what happens again and again and again and again. whether it's the Bolsheviks, I mean, just look at classic cases, look at the Bolsheviks, look at the American Revolution. I mean, what was that? It was influential Americans conspiring to overthrow British rule in their territory, which they did. It was a conspiracy that worked. Or Julius Caesar taking power, or Julius Caesar being stabbed by other senators, both conspiracies, I mean,
exactly.
Yeah. So I mean,
conspiracy. There's always conspirators.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So conspiring and stuff, especially if you're in that kind of power, conspiring is almost the normal thing to do. Actually, you know what I mean?
Perfectly normal. Normal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, Mugabe wins the 1980 elections, entrenches himself, and he really he kind of briefly changes his tune. He had been extremely agitative against the white farmers back then already. The Marxists have this weird idea about land. They got this weird, I don't know, land is everything, and it's just they really have they really just, I don't know, it's just Marxist doctrine. And he was set about as well entrenching himself, so getting his cronies into, obviously the settlement they had reached at Lancaster House in 1979, just before, in November 1979, it basically laid out that for 10 years there would be a situation of this many representations from this party and this and that, and the white representations and all that sort of thing. But to cut a long story short, Robert Mugabe in the early 1980s, the first 5 or so years that he was in power, he set about entrenching his men in the key positions and eliminating political opponents. Very interestingly enough, before he actually sent a whole lot of youngsters, young ZANU, PF, Zanla guys over to North Korea to get trained in North Korean Marxist tactics. And they came back to Zimbabwe and they were rebranded the 5th Brigade. And this particular 5th Brigade was essentially the hit squad of ZANU PF. What would happen in the early 1980s, there was Joshua Nkomo was already starting to speak out against Robert Mugabe's. He saw, no, this guy is taking over everything, and it's not actually what the agreement would be agreed to. This is not what, he kind of played the, or even though he was on the losing side, he tried to play the I'm the great Democrat type of person, but it was actually just sore loser vibes, because he came from exactly the same ideology basically, just a different faction thereof. And anyway, Robert Mugabe essentially sent the 5th Brigade into Matabele land, and he basically subjugated ZANU's ZAPU, which were based in Matabele land mostly, and that's in and around Bulawayo area. And the 5th Brigade basically went on a violence and intimidation to crush their support, to crush their will to oppose him. And it's estimated that Mugabe actually had intelligence reports saying there were maybe 2, 3, a few hundred dissidents in Matabele land who were maybe politically opposing him. But he went in there and just crushed anything. So if you had any sort of connection to people who were known to be politically active and opposing ZANU, you died. All right. There's well documented evidence of abandoned mines and trucks being offloading bodies down the mine shafts.
So this is not, and it's important to note this, Russell, and this is also a massive Marxist move and stuff. It's not just oaks that were sort of campaigning against Mugabe. It's if you merely didn't support him.
He wasn't taking any chances. He was that ruthless. So
he didn't want to take a chance of any different ideology forming. So he wiped everything out. And
basically, any sort of, even if you had a mild connection, you died. You know, you can even speak to people from Bulawayo, the older crowd. They'll tell you they had family members disappear. I've spoken to people from Bulawayo and other areas of Matabele land where, you know, their disappearances and all that sort of thing. And what happened is even journalists who did report at the time that they visited these mine shafts. Obviously, they couldn't see any bodies, but as you peer down into the darkness, the smell of death hits you, of the rotting corpses. So a lot of people just disappeared.
And this is pretty. I was just going to say, and putting it again into this sort of historical context, this sort of thing is extremely common with these sort of leftist revolutionary movements, where once a certain faction seizes power, one of the first things they do after they establish themselves, or if there's kind of this uneasy transition period, is whoever's most able to will immediately purge all potential rivals or dissident voices out of the party. In the Soviet Union, they had it was called literally the Great Purge, and yeah, we could make a whole episode out of that down the line. How revolutionary parties tend to purge themselves, and the French revolutionaries did this themselves. It goes back that far, and they same thing too with different factions, which more recently in North Korea after Kim Jong-il died, and when Kim Jong-un was coming up, he purged some of his, you know, even family members and stuff to make sure that he's the guy on top. So
let's not Marxism is a disease, you know. Make no mistakes about that, you know. But it's good that you brought up the overarching. There's always an overarching broad context that these things play out. The playbook is remarkably similar.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so frustrating to see these things play out, is because you kind of know how it's going to end, you know, ahead of time. So I'm sure there are people who saw this happening, and that's probably why your guy's dad decided to go to South Africa. He's like, all right, I know how this ends. Let's move south.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, the thing is, he just saw, you know, Robert Mugabe as saying, yeah, look, you know, Mugabe just didn't fill my dad with any sort of confidence whatsoever, you know. But moving on, I mean, the thing is, so Mugabe is now moving until the late 90s or so, to the late 80s, all these sorts of things. Obviously these things didn't happen all overnight. There was and you must remember at this stage, Mugabe's even after this Matabele uprising, or this there was a specific name, the Guga. I can't remember the name. There was a name that they had this that they gave this 5th Brigade's operation. Can't remember what it was.
I'll look that up while you're going.
Just look it up quickly.
Yeah.
And what happened was, you must remember, this was completely ignored in the Western media, and if it was mentioned, it was kind of just brushed aside and said, don't worry, Mugabe's great. There was no move. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And it wasn't, even if it was seen as true, it was say, we don't care anymore. Zimbabwe now. We've done our work. It's their problem. So that's also how Westerners seem to approach the issue around Zimbabwe as well. we've done our bit. We've done our social justice warrior nonsense and fanaticism, but now any sort of things that actually count, it's not our problem anymore. Yeah. But so what actually moving on as well, obviously, as things start getting a bit tougher, moving into the late 90s, one of the things that offset the current situation in Zimbabwe, by this stage, Zimbabwe, although with lots of political problems and all this sort of thing, it was still considered a stable state until the late 90s or so. And then what happened was there was a movement amongst so-called the military wing of the
veterans. Yes,
the veterans. They call themselves veterans, but I call them cowards, useless anyway. But anyway, veterans. We all call them. They call themselves veterans, but they got upset because
just like our Mkonto Sizwe veterans over here.
Hey, listen, Zanla's veterans aren't actually too bad compared to MK. MK was the greatest bunch.
MK is
they're rubbish. Zanla wasn't.
It's funny how some of these MK veteran meetups and stuff, and some of the oaks are like 25 years old and stuff.
Look, the MK was a joke. MK was a joke. Zanla wasn't, in relative terms, wasn't actually that rubbish. But anyway, the war veterans in the late 90s started to make agitations, saying, well, listen, Mugabe's looked after his crowd, his cronies, all right? And said they've all got nice jobs, good cabinet posts, access to they've got the jobs in the state-owned enterprises. They've got the jobs, they've been given concessions and farms and all this sort of thing. But hey, we're the ones that put our lives on the line. Where's our payment,
And as I understand it, before the land invasions or possibly leading up to it, one of the things they were demanding for was pensions. Is that correct?
Pensions for veterans.
Yeah.
And essentially what happened was overnight, the Zimbabwe budget just blew completely out of proportion. And the Zim dollar fell, I think, in one day, 25% in 2000 or something like that. And what happened was the monetary amounts were not sufficient to cover the demands of the war veterans. So the war veterans were able to basically, and this is where the war veterans were able to swing the military generals onto their side, who basically Mugabe said, okay, well, listen, I need the military generals on my side.
Right.
So I'm moving in this direction. So now I've got to pay these guys off. It's all about the gang. And also you must remember as well, you get people also, it's also good to have these military guys with you because they're useful, because what you can do is once you get them to commit atrocities for you, all right, they're actually loyal, because now they can't afford to go against you, because if you lose, then they go down with you. Get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
unless, of course, they become willing participants in replacing you, which also functions as some incentive for Mugabe to see that these guys get bankrolled, because he's like, oh shit, if they flip on me, I just need to see that these guys get paid, and
correct.
To hell with the consequences.
When they ran out of money to pay these guys off, they just said, okay, go help yourself to some land. just go and help yourself, And that's essentially what happened. It was completely illegal. Those, even according to Zimbabwe, they didn't make any laws or anything in Zimbabwe. Any sort of parliamentary or any due process or anything.
Kind of happened.
Go help yourself.
Yeah.
I think that was also the good way to do it, because if he said go help yourselves, then they would fight amongst themselves for who got the land. You get what I'm saying? He didn't have to get involved in the division of it and all that sort of thing. He can kind of wash his hands of it. So it was a good move strategically from him, That's probably, I think that's the part that guys like Julius Malema love, because that showed clear political brilliance in a way. You know, one of those things, to lie convincingly is a sign of superior intelligence or something. You know what I mean? That's what Lenin said, I think. You know, to lie convincingly is a sign of superior intelligence. But that's essentially where it all started. Over the next, say, 5 years, they had their inflation, then hyperinflation. Then they reached the massive hyperinflation in about 2007, 2008, when I think, I don't know, you pick a number, gazillion% inflation. You know, you probably could take a piece of toilet paper up to Zimbabwe and it was worth more than a piece of currency, than a paper of currency. You know what I mean? And so what happened then after that was there were actually elections in 2008, which ZANU-PF actually lost. Okay, and he basically
called them again.
He called them again. All right. This time.
Wrong answer. Vote harder next time.
And then, unfortunately, I don't know what happened, but the MDC were somehow co-opted or persuaded or something. They made a terrible, terrible political blunder in getting into a coalition government with ZANU-PF, who they eventually completely outmaneuvered. They did manage to get the Minister of Finance position in the cabinet, or the Reserve Bank governor position or something like that, to bring some sort of a seemingly, but Mugabe eventually outmaneuvered all of them as well, and we were back to square one within about 3 or 4 years. All that had come to an end, you know. It's one of the great things, that opportunity was completely lost. They should never have gotten involved with gone into government, you know. But at the same time, they probably went into government with ZANU-PF simply because they had a bit of a conscience, you know. Unlike ZANU-PF, who just doesn't care, MDC did have a little bit of a conscience. They say, well, listen, look at the position that we're in. We are hyperinflating. We, you know, look at the situation we're in. We better do something, you know. At least we might have a chance of bringing it round. But they failed terribly at it. Mugabe outmaneuvered them. And you know, we've still got. He stole those elections in 2008 anyway, and yeah, he's just, from then onwards, it was more. There's also a rumor about how the military generals, he was actually willing to. There's a story that he actually, after those elections, was willing to stand down himself. But the generals in the military said, no, you must stay here because it gives us credibility. We want the system to carry on going. You like the fall guy. We like kind of banking you in the future. You're old now, but when you go, we can also just pin everything on you, type of thing, you know.
Jeez.
So it's quite clever there as well. You know, having Mugabe there it's kind of in the international media and that sort of thing. You can kind of defer all fault to him, you know. Meanwhile, it's a whole gang. You know, it's not just a one man. And the interesting thing about the new president, Mnangagwa, Emerson, his nickname is Crocodile. You know where he got that name Crocodile from? Guess where he was in 1982, 83?
South Africa.
No, he was the one overseeing the what was going on in Matabele land.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, I was about to say. I was like, wait a second. 80s.
That's Crocodile for those people he ate.
Jeez. So he was Mugabe's Che Guevara. Okay, nice.
Yeah,
pretty much.
Emerson. He is. That's where he got the name Crocodile, because of all the people he ate.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it seems like in terms of on the economic front, at least, like if I sort of look at the numbers, because of all the sanctions and stuff, and this is sort of true of South Africa too during the end of apartheid, because of all the sanctions, they're under a tremendous economic crunch. And then because they're so integrated in the global trade network. And then the war is over, sanctions are lifted, Rhodesia becomes Zimbabwe, and then there's a bit of a bounce back. And then for a while, things are kind of okay. But then, as you're saying, the cronyism, the state capture, all that sort of stuff ends up happening. And then, you know, essentially the state bites off more than they can chew, and they kind of, through corruption, and then eventually they kind of have to, they're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place themselves. So I imagine the ANC probably, and going to sort of the what you'd call the lessons portion of this.
Correct.
Because if you look at Mugabe's government sort of towards the end there, they were kind of, it's almost like they couldn't stop after a certain point. Like they had just crippled everything, and now it's going to cause enormous political tension, possible collapse of the government, or replacement with somebody who will play ball with the military and paramilitary factions. So just print the money. You know, that's the easiest thing to do in the world. So, and now with the South African situation, looking at it, it's sort of one of those deals now where how do you like put the wine back in the bottle? You know, it's kind of, they've promised so much to so many people in terms of financial compensation, social grants and whatnot, and they've got all these people built into the state-owned enterprises. Like one of the reasons, I'm sure one of the reasons why they don't just say, okay, you know, Eskom, we're just going to privatize everything, we're going to fire tons of you, is because if they did that, thousands of disgruntled former Eskom employees would destroy the power stations. You know, it's sort of one of those things where it's very sort of precarious, you know, treacherous situation that the government finds themselves in. And yes, they need to make changes. First off, I think they don't necessarily want to make them because of the ideological involvement and the, frankly, ruthlessness which you'd have to pursue sane policies. But the other is just they're kind of, you know, this is the bitter fruit they've wrought for themselves, you know.
Yeah, and the thing is, you know, one of the things is these guys are good at lying, you know. So when you see when you see them praising Marxism, and a lot of the quotes that are hidden from history about Robert Mugabe, where he basically praised Marxism, eventually there was kind of like scrubbed out of documents and all that sort of thing. And it's so much smoke and mirrors. These guys they deal in deception. That's just how they operate. They don't. Yeah. Lies, deceit, deception, smoke and mirrors. You know, you can't nail these guys down. They're slippery as anything, you know. But at the same time, that you got to look at it, that in itself. Stop trying to view everything when you deal with these guys in terms of, oh, he said this, he said that, he said. You can't do that. You got to actually look at the actions. You got to look at what actually is happening as it's unfolding. Yeah. So, you know, like, you know, the whole thing can also, there's lots of reasons for this Zimbabwean thing. One of the things is, and a lot of the parts of, and Africa generally, is that my feeling is that there would have been at that time in the 1950s or so, early 60s, support for a roadmap for the relinquishing of colonial powers. Kind of like a Hong Kong situation where there was a roadmap to handing it back to China, sort of thing, you know. That should have been the approach in Africa.
Yeah.
You know, but it just seems I cannot believe that so-called smart people thought it was a good idea to just like create a power vacuums. I mean, these people aren't stupid. You know, I can't see it as anything else than willful. I don't think I really do not believe, I don't buy the argument saying, we didn't know that was going to happen. You know, that whole plausible deniability thing. I don't buy it anymore.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things. For one thing, at this point in time, there's a lot of, particularly in the United States, social tension in the late 60s, early 70s. A lot of people will say, oh, America now is the most divided it's ever been. And, demographically that might be true, but in terms of ideology and stuff, oh man, there was way more terrorist activity. There were fire bombings and stuff, people blowing up police stations. Crime was significantly higher then than it was now. And you have this leftist intelligentsia in universities keen on being like, oh, you're supporting these colonial powers and stuff and so on and so forth. So basically they could, there's two parts of it. I think they sort of wanted to wash their hands of the situation and be like, look, we're the good guys, kind of political virtue signaling after a fashion. And the second point is they didn't really care what happened afterwards because it's Africa.
Combination.
You know what? So I think that's one thing.
If you didn't really, you didn't really care, then why? If you didn't really care, what people don't understand is that colonialism, for generally speaking, in Africa, if you look at the Portuguese and the French and the British and that sort of thing, it was actually costing them a lot of money. They weren't actually, they weren't filling their coffers actually because of colonialism. That's the truth. A lot of people don't like to hear that. Oh, no, they were just taking all the resources for but they were spending a lot of the resources to keep the countries together and sorted and that sort of thing. They were reinvesting and all that sort of thing. They didn't make hordes of money. And an interesting thing, one of the things that kept ZANU-PF in power, interestingly financially, is the discovery of the Marangwe diamonds fields. Those diamonds were basically annexed by the party. So blood diamond trade, kept ZANU-PF going. Kind of completely. There was like that happened in about 2008, 9, 10, around there somewhere. That diamond field was discovered, and that basically was annexed by the party, and that's essentially where they've had their money. That's how the only means of them getting any type of currency or anything like that is through that. That was one. So the genuine blood situation.
That all went into Mugabe's collection of 18 Maseratis and 25 Rolls Royces, probably, or something like that.
Yeah, well, and to pay off party henchmen and whatever you as well. So, yeah, it's just...
and obviously to pay hospital bills in Singapore.
Yeah, well, look, like I said, if you want to describe Mugabe, basically... He's right up there with Che Guevara, right up there with Fidel Castro, right up there with any of the Leninist, Marxist, Maoist, Chairman Mao, Pol Pot. He's right up there. He's right up there with him.
Just an absolute, utter piece of shit that would go and destroy his entire country's healthcare system and then hop on a private jet off to Singapore for treatment that costs $80,000 a day or something stupid and all of that. What a prize gentleman. And you know what the fucking stupidest thing ever is that in the last elections, whether they were democratic or whatever, there was actually the fact that there was even one person stupid enough to vote for this fucking idiot is just beyond me.
Yeah.
No, well, look, must remember the reason the voter turnout is really, really low, all right? And you must remember it's a Westminster type system, and there's more seats in the rural areas than in the urban areas, all right?
Yeah.
The urban areas almost completely opposition won, and the rural areas are won by ZANU-PF. But he has drawn the lines in such a way that the rural areas get all the seats, all right?
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of little provisions that he's written into the Constitution and the electoral process that keep him in power as well. And no one's ever called him out on this. Every year they have elections and he wins it. The Western media just shrugs their shoulders and says, he won it.
Mugabe wins again.
Okay. You know, meanwhile, I think in the one presidential election, I think it was 99, 2000, around their president, because they actually have presidential elections there. Only their voter turnout was only like 35%.
Yeah.
So they do have very, very low voter turnout. You know, so that's also one of the sort of issues there as well. So
yeah, and the other thing too is in these rural situations. And you see the same thing too, to a lesser extent in South Africa, is the people in charge make sure that those votes go the way they want to a certain extent. They'll strong arm them into voting a certain way, or they'll just stuff the ballot boxes and no one's there to check, because it's in the middle of freaking nowhere.
Correct.
Well, it's the same way that the ANC campaigns here in South Africa. It's exactly the same way. They target the rural areas. I mean, most of the ANC's voter base comes from the rural areas. It's the exact same thing.
If you look at the patterns in the four big metros, they're losing those.
It's because, I mean, it's the same. Look, you got to understand is that fellow South Africans, realize this and know that the South African government is playing from the same playbook that Mugabe plays from.
Just look at their press statement after he died.
Shock horror, guys.
It's ridiculous. Listen, Julius Malema called him a hero, a liberator, a perfect human being.
A perfect human being.
Well, even the cucked opposition, Musi the Pussy Maimane, I mean, he doesn't even call the Oak Art as the piece of shit that he was. I mean,
no, not really.
Use that opportunity, Musi. Use that opportunity to be a strong opposition.
This Musi Maimane really believes that he can win over ANC and EFF supporters.
What an idiot! What an idiot!
He really thinks he can. He needs to, that's what I don't understand. He's a lunatic, this guy. The voting patterns are pretty clear of how they vote. People, generally, an existing ANC voter either continues to vote ANC, doesn't vote at all, votes EFF, or votes DA. I mean, you're way down on the level of order. You know what I mean? But look, we're getting on to South Africa now. But we were here to discuss Mugabe.
So, Russell, what I want to find out, okay, obviously this absolute piece of dog shit is gone now. Thank the Lord. I hope he's rotting in hell, and I hope God is judging him.
Can you just hold it a sec? Can you just hold it for a sec? I'll be back in a sec.
So basically, Russell, what I want to ask you now is okay, here's the thing, is that Mugabe is dead now. But unfortunately, all his policies and everything that he's put into position still stand. And I want to find out what you think is what comes next. Is it just sort of status quo, or what do you think is going to happen next for Zimbabwe?
Well, look, I mean, I actually don't know if there's anything left that the international community can even do. ZANU-PF has showed itself it's got no conscience. It doesn't really care what happens to the country. So your bargaining power there you can't threaten them at all, because they don't really care. So you can't tell.
Sorry, we lost you there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys. I don't know what happened. It was just going, and then you're like, all right, 118, and then I just got this blue screen, and I'm like, what's going on?
So I've just asked Russell what he thinks is going to happen next. Is it going to be status quo? What's the story? Because now, obviously, Mugabe's policies and everything are still intact. You know what I mean? So carry on, Russell.
So, well, look, I mean, ZANU-PF has shown themselves to not have any conscience. You can't threaten them with destroying their country. You know what I mean?
The country's
you can't. You can't. They can't pay for. They can't pay for or generate their own electricity. They can't generate anything. There's just absolutely nothing going on. So you can't sabotage them at all. There's nothing left to sabotage. So they really don't care, and that's the real scary part. You got individuals that are completely without any empathy, complete sociopaths. And how do you reason with sociopaths? This is the thing. I don't know. And another problem, that's the one part. Another part is that, to be completely honest, let's just call it as it is. All right. Zimbabwe's, especially Shona group, all right, are probably the most placid oaks in Africa, actually. Even though Mugabe is from that tribal ethno group, they are incredibly placid, all right. They don't easily rise up. They kind of go with the flow. They're very, very, I don't know, they're too easy going. I think if some of the groups,
Hawaiians,
if you look at, I don't think the ANC would be able to get away with that type of thing in South Africa, simply because the guys here feel nothing. They'll kill until change happens. Whereas in Zimbabwe, the shame, those guys are actually decent folk, not like the guys here. These, the Zimbabwe oaks are just too nice. Is basically. So you've got a government, a state that is got nothing to lose. There's nothing left to sabotage for an outside power. You've got a group of people who are very by nature very placid. I actually don't have an answer. I don't know what's going to bring down ZANU-PF. I don't believe it. Seriously, it's one thing I know is not going to happen and that's a democratic process. All right, it's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. They're not going to be brought down by democratic processes. There'll have to be sort of.
I think Russell. I think what the only thing that's really going to save Zimbabwe is pretty much the only thing that can really save any African country, and that's a benevolent dictator. That's the only thing that's going to be able to help them.
Well, that's the other thing left over, is that somehow Zimbabwe. The only thing that Zimbabwe can possibly be now is some type of vassal state. That's it. Basically, a dictator supported by a foreign power, but a decent dictator. That's their best bet for change. I'm looking at it like that. It's not going to happen through democratic processes.
Well, I mean, we all know democracy is a pile of shit anyway. So if it doesn't happen via democracy, good.
Yeah, well, look, eventually you would have to have a re-establishment of everything. You'd have to probably have about 15, 20 years of some sort of benign dictator, authoritarian type, not a totalitarian, but authoritarian dictatorship of ruthless efficiency to actually, and then you could probably 5-10 over the next, say, 5-10 years after that, maybe hand over to a democratic or liberal constitution, or let's not use that word, but whatever, then you could look after it. But you're going to have 20 years of some sort of ruthless, efficient dictatorship.
A Pinochet,
or even dare I say, he seems to be hated in a lot of African circles at the moment. Yeah, but even a Paul Kagame would be all right as well.
Yeah, but that's the only that's the whole thing. Is I mean I don't see an out for Zimbabwe. I think that some sort of benevolent dictator, like you say, an authoritarian dictator can come in and seize power and say, you know what, you oaks have been playing games for too long. Now it's time to sort something out. But then again, he needs to be a dictator that does something like what Pinochet did, and kind of fix things straight and stuff, and then step back and let the economy do its own thing. Otherwise,
there'd have to be. And I mean, the thing is, there'd have to be a vassal state.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing left to build it up. It's almost like a recolonization light.
Recolonization light. You should go give that talk at Cape Town University, man.
Yeah, I think solutions for Zimbabwe. Your best option is a benign dictator under basically a vassal stateship of Western power or even some other powerful country. You know what I mean? That's the best we could do.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, guys, I think we should finish up. That was quite a long one, about an hour and 20 minutes. D-Dog, do you want to add some closing statements or anything?
No, man. I mean, it's just the situation's so foobar. What do you do from there? I mean, I think Russell's right. I don't think there's any democratic solutions for Zimbabwe. I mean, voting harder is not going to change a thing. I mean, this has been going on for decades. So, I mean, if the people really wanted to vote for change or were allowed the, fair and free elections, it would have happened already, but it hasn't. And 2 periods of hyperinflation under their belt, I mean, that's already happening right now. I mean, the country's been run into the ground again and again, and nothing's changing. So if anything happens, there's going to have to be some kind of internal insurrection. But again, these things don't usually, there's very seldom such a thing as a grassroots revolution. It just doesn't happen. So until some other elites come along who don't want to co-opt the system but restructure things, nothing's going to change.
Russell?
So sorry, Zimbabwe. Bad news.
Yeah, cry Zimbabwe. And I will say just 2 things. 1, don't believe Marxists. Number 2, democracy sucks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with both of you guys fully. I do believe that the only way that Zimbabwe is going to sort itself out is by some sort of vassal state and stuff. It's quite ironic that I guess this is our view, and many liberals will sorry, I just got very, very sick in my mouth, and libertarians would be prone to democracy and stuff, but there's no chance. It's just not going to happen. Some sort of anarchy, and then some sort of, I guess the closest to that would probably be, I guess, a lot of people, it's debatable, but the Philippines, I think, is a vassal state. Probably the closest example of what I think would have to happen in Zimbabwe. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for listening. Do you guys have anything else to add? Can we cut off?
No, I'm done.
Good, man.
Thanks so much for listening, guys. Eh?
It's very upsetting, or nothing further to say.
Yeah, sorry, Zim. Sorry, guys. I just hope that in 20 years' time from now, we won't be saying sorry, South Africa, as well. Anyway, guys, on that note, we'll say good night. Thank you so much for listening. Remember to subscribe to the channel. Go check out Dylan's based Twitter. Go and check it out. Facebook page is also pretty active. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Click the like button, subscribe, stay reactionary out there, because
God wills it.
God wills it.
God wills it.